So today is going to be another one of our nuts and bolts lecture. That is, we have discussed the political changes last time with regard to the growth of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the enormous and quick growth, and then its interaction with its immediate western neighbor, Poland. And we've seen some key dates here, 1385, the beginning of that relationship, and then certainly 1569, Lublin, and the creation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So we have the political structure, if you will, political developments. Now we need today to step back and look at this same period, but from the framework of the internal structure and the internal concrete relationships, and in another sense, the socio-economic developments within this area, which included the former Rus lands of modern-day Ukraine. So first, with regard to the social structure, while the Lithuanians still lived within the parameters of their traditional homeland, as we saw last night, not on this map, but up north along the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea, but in particular the Neman and western Dvina River valleys. And before they were united into a political unity or an entity in the 13th century, in the 1240s, under that ruler that we knew called Mindaugas. So before all of that took place, the social structure of Lithuania remained relatively simple. Basically, there were three social strata, the tribal princes and their families, free persons organized into tribal units, and slaves. The slaves originally being prisoners of war. But after Lithuania, the Lithuanian tribes were brought together under the leadership of this Mindaugas in the mid-13th century, and after the country had expanded southward into the Rus lands of what is today Belarus and Ukraine, which we looked at last time, and then had come into contact with more highly developed social structures on those lands, that is, those lands that were once part of the Kievan Rus Federation. It soon became necessary for the Lithuanians to adapt to this new situation. And that adaptation took the following form. Lithuania's Grand Dukes, that is the supreme ruler of the Grand Duchy, made land grants to those individuals who supported them. First, it could be to local village leaders, then to the church, and most especially to the large number of warriors who contributed to the expansion, to the rapid expansion of the state. And so while Lithuania's rulers, as I said last time, really didn't touch much of the social and in particular Orthodox cultural and religious structure of Old Rus, they kind of superimposed their control by allotting large estates to members of their own ruling dynasty, and they were still all pagan, by the way, but also to the local Rus hereditary princes that were still in their lands and that who cooperated with them. Cooperation, no problem. And so the newly enhanced position of Lithuania's Rus boyars, those land-holding elements in the Rus state, in particular in Galicia and Volhynia, and then the gentry, or the barons, as were known. After the 1430s and after the 1440s, when the other Grand Duke that is related to Lithuanian rule, and this was a man named Vytautas. He was the cousin of Jogaila, of course, who became Jagiello. Under Vytautas's reign at the beginning of the 15th century, more than 4 decades actually, adherents of the new Roman Catholic faith were granted noble privileges, the Lithuanians having accepted Roman Catholicism, as we saw under Jagiello in 1385. But toward the end of Vytautas's reign, we're still sticking with the Lithuanian component, and under his successors, the rights of the Orthodox were reaffirmed, and the boyars, the big landowners of that faith, were allowed full participation in the Lithuanian socio-political structure. Now, as we saw last time, Lithuania was from 1385 in union with Poland through the person of that kingdom's ruling monarch, Jogaila, the former Lithuanian who became Jagiello, or Władysław II Jagiello, king of Poland. So that was the relationship through the person of the king, while in practice Lithuania functioned as an independent state, and that lasted until the Union of Lublin in 1569. During those years, 1385, 1569, Lithuania was governed by its own laws. Its legal system, by the way, was strongly influenced by that of former Kievan Rus. In fact, it was Rus law itself, the same Rus law that began in the 11th century with Yaroslav I the Wise, the Grand Prince of Kiev. It was this same Rus law that actually governed the Grand Duchy until as late as 1468. And then finally in that year, the Lithuanians issued their first of their own law codes. This was followed by 3 other law codes known as the Lithuanian statutes that were adopted in the course of the 1500s. And even though they have their own law code now finally, still very heavily influenced by the Rus law code. Now, the country, Lithuania's social structure, favored the dominant position of a small group of hereditary princes, as you can see on this chart, known as kniazy, which is the Slavonic word for prince, kniaz. And that social structure fostered cultural diversity within an otherwise now Roman Catholic country. And so we have Roman Catholic elite coexisting with the non-hereditary Orthodox nobles and certainly the hereditary Orthodox princes. The continuing influence of the Rus social and legal norms upon Lithuanian society was both evident both in the form and the content of the Lithuanian law codes, as well as other state documents, all of which were written in something called Chancellery Ruthenian. So the Lithuanians, the Grand Duchy, did not use Lithuanian, which is a Baltic language, but rather Ruthenian, that is, and that's what it was called. And really what this was the heavily Belarusian and Ukrainian influence of the otherwise liturgical, but now secular literary language, Church Slavonic. And this medium, Chancellery Ruthenian, served as the administrative and cultural written medium of communication for the Grand Duchy as a whole. And yet, despite its distinct characteristics, Lithuanian society during the 15th and especially 16th centuries, precisely this period we are looking at, was marked by increasing receptiveness to Polish influences from the West. Now, with regard now to Poland. We saw how in Poland the founding Piast dynasty ended in 1370 with the death of Kazimierz the Great, as he is known in Polish history. So that's the end of the founding Piast dynasty. And after that, and I mentioned this last time, Poland gradually evolved into what is called an aristocratic democracy, an entity in which the political prerogatives of that second social stratum on your list, the nobility, continued to expand, both at the expense of the king's authority, as well as other stratum within the society. And this continued throughout the period of the Jagiellonian dynasty, which lasted from 1385, when Jogaila became King Władysław Jagiello, until that dynasty came to an end in 1572, just after the Union of Lublin. So this is the Jagiellonian period. And after the death of the last of the Jagiellonian rulers in 1572, Poland formally became an elective monarchy. In a sense, here, the king is chosen by the nobility. As for Poland's social structure, it was composed of several social strata, or stani in Polish. We call them social estates. And these social estates, by the way, are frequently confused with the more modern notion of socioeconomic classes. Keep in mind, social estates, classes, two different things. Why? Well, the social estates in Polish society were not based on the relationship to the means of production or to any other means of wealth or economic status. That's class. Rather, those social estates and members of them were determined by the intended function of this social estate within society, and that was expressed by specific legal rights and privileges for each of these, or requirements for each of these estates. And in this regard, one can speak of 6 social estates, social strata in 15th and 16th century Poland, and there they are outlined on your chart here. The crown, the nobility, the clergy, townspeople, Jews, and peasants. Membership in each of these social strata, it was in practice hereditary, or theoretically hereditary, so that social mobility within them, it was difficult, but in the end not impossible. Difficult, why? Because there were usually, in order for it to happen, very complex legal difficulties had to be gone through and so forth and so on. It happened, but not often. Again, let us not forget that wealth was not a determining factor, since very often there were, let's say, townspeople, Jews, even some peasants who were more wealthy than certain nobles. But nonetheless, despite their wealth, if you will, again, with very rare exceptions, they were barred from entering the noble estate. Now, a few words about these social strata, both now and in our next lecture. First, that strata number one, the crown. Well, the role of the crown was to represent the unity of the realm, the ultimate representative of the Polish kingdom. And either that alone or through the person of the king, as we're going to see, also the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Oh, and then after 1573, as an elected head of the unified Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, the king's authority was, as I already mentioned last time, progressively restricted by concessions to the Polish nobility and to the Grand Dukes of Lithuania, as were outlined in those various documents from the late 14th to 16th century. We have the first one in Košice, when Louis of Anjou, the king of Poland and Hungary, wanted to give his daughter to become the queen, but her husband to become the king. And so each time there was negotiation over the royal position, the new king had to provide new incentives or guarantees to the nobility. But despite this, until the very end of Poland's existence, in the second half of the 18th century, there was never any question of the need for this estate. So you had to have a king, you had to have a crown estate. How much power, that's a different story. But we need a king, because he represents the whole, he's the ultimate representative of Poland. And so it didn't make a difference whether hereditary or elective, needed him to function as head of the social structure. Number two here in our list, to be sure, could probably get the implication of what I'm saying already, the most influential estate, social estate within Poland was the nobility, or in Polish known as the szlachta, which, by the way, comes from a German word, Schlacht, which means battle. So this was the social estate that was concerned with fighting, at least initially. Now, theoretically, there was really only one noble social estate. Why? Because all of its members were equal before the law. In practice, however, there existed great disparities with regard to the wealth and therefore social prestige. But again, remember, wealth doesn't determine membership in an estate, but nonetheless, in practice, those who were more wealthy had more influence. Technically, everybody in Canada is equal, right? Well, there are some that are more equal than others, very often related to the amount of wealth that they may possess. So this is normal society, if you will. And so both contemporaries and subsequent analysts of Polish society divide the nobility into at least two groups. And as you can see on your list, the magnates, or the heads of the great families, who, because of their extensive wealth, practically ran the affairs of the state. And the other, the gentry, who had limited wealth. By the way, in some cases, they did not even own land. You could be a noble without land, as long as you had your crest, family crest. Crucial. I don't know if you ever heard of a late 19th century English novel by Thomas Hardy called Tess, or Tess of Uberville. It's a great love story written in the Hardy-esque naturalistic or realistic fashion, but they made a good film of it. It's worth seeing this film, and it's about, she comes from a family that was very poor, had no really wealth, and therefore had no influence or protection if there was a problem in late 19th century English society, lived in this terribly poor hut, but on top of the hut of the door was a crest. They were nobles. No influence, no power, but they were nobles. Interestingly, the film was made by the great Polish director of the 19th century, of the second half of the 20th century, whose name escapes me, but the idea of putting that emphasis on the crest, very important. Now, the gentry also sometimes is described itself according to subdivision. So you could have a middle gentry and petty gentry. The petty gentry is the lowest of the low, so to speak, maybe the ones without land are even lower. But the point of all of this is that despite great disparities between the magnates and the gentry, all were recognized as part of one legal social stratum or social estate, the nobility or the Schlachta. And all shared equally the legal privileges of that social estate. In many ways, the entire internal social history of Poland during the 15th and 16th centuries, effectively during the Jagiellonian period, is the story of how the noble social estate succeeded in increasing its privileges, not only vis-a-vis the crown, but also vis-a-vis the church, the townspeople, and the peasants. Well, how did they get away with this? Well, theoretically, justification for the nobility's privileges derived from their role as defenders of the realm, those who entered into battle to defend Poland. Hence the Schlacht people, the Schlachta. And in fact, they continued to fulfill that function at least until the end of the 16th century, our period. But after that, the traditional call to arms, where they had to show up if the king calls them, they got that privilege to be removed. Not privilege, they got that responsibility to be removed. And so when there was subsequently any times of danger, the kingdom was defended by some kind of permanent armed force or hirelings, which is going to be now, that whole fact is very important for the history of Ukraine and when we move into the Ukrainian component of this story. Back to our Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which now included, or up until 1569, included most Rus lands. There, the position of the nobles was substantially different than in Poland. Most Lithuanian nobles were non-hereditary, therefore much more beholden to the Grand Duke in pre-war, or the Grand Duke who was in power at any given time. In other words, non-hereditary nobles in Lithuania had no tradition of immunities like those enjoyed by their counterparts in Poland. On the other hand, at the very top of Lithuania's noble social structure were the powerful hereditary princes, princely families, and that including Rus hereditary princes from Kievan times, the Ostrowskis, Radzivils, Vishnevetsky's. And these people ruled, in some cases, entire regions of the Grand Duchy, almost as if they were semi-independent sovereigns, and of course, boasting the title of prince. They didn't call themselves anything else but prince. Below them were a whole host of non-hereditary nobles, boyars, gentry barons, who were in one way or another dependent either on the Grand Duke or on the Grand Duchy's powerful hereditary princes, including these Rus princes. In such a situation, Lithuania's non-hereditary nobles looked with envy. They're quite envious, and it makes sense, on those nobles in neighboring Poland with all of the privileges that they enjoyed. And it was these non-hereditary types in Lithuania and on Ukrainian lands who actually welcomed the union of Lublin with Poland, and then all Ukrainian lands became part of the Kingdom of Poland. They welcomed this. Why? Well, under Polish rule, they were granted equality with Polish nobles, as well as legal equality among themselves. Now, compared to other European countries at the time, the Polish nobility represented a relatively large proportion of the country's population. If you have any friends who are of Polish background, whether in the immigration in the United States and so on, you talk to them, everybody has some noble forebear. I mean, well, could very well be, considering the fact that, for instance, in 1569, the Union of Lublin, there were about 500,000 nobles. They made up 6% roughly of the population of Poland. 75 years later, in 1648, the middle of the 17th century, those numbers increased to close to 1 million. That is, they represented nobles 9% of the population. I mean, this was enormous in terms of numbers within Poland and in comparison with other countries in Europe. Of course, only about 5,000 or 10,000 of these were the magnates, the big guys. The remaining were gentry. But nonetheless, nobles with the crest and with the privileges. By the way, the administrative structure of the country was also reflected reflected the needs of the influential noble estate. Poland and later Lithuania was divided into what we call in English palatinates. Palatinates, in Polish województwa. Palatinates, województwa. Each palatinate, usually in a castle, but certainly an administrative center, was the king's representative, or starosta. But more important, in each of these palatinates was a small, elected, only by the nobility, seimik. It's called seimik, which means like a little seim. Seim is diet, so the seimiks are dietines, we'll call them. We'll make a kind of small little word out of the English diet. So now we have these dietines. Why do I mention this? Each of these palatinates had a dietine, and it was from these dietines that developed the idea of a single legislative institution for the entire country, the diet, or in Polish, the Sejm. And the first of these Sejms met in 1493 actually, and thereafter every 2 years for 6-week sessions. So very important was the session of the Sejm, the diet. The Sejm composed of 2 houses. There was a Senate composed of high officials within the country, religious and secular, bishops, archbishops, Polish and later Lithuanian ministers of state, almost always magnates, and military leaders. And all of the members of the Senate were appointed by the king. And then there was a chamber of deputies, usually middle gentry, composed of delegates chosen by whom? Chosen by these local dietines in each of the palatinates, which in turn were made up exclusively of nobles. And after the agreements reached at Lublin, creating the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1569, the nobles from both parts of the Commonwealth now, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, as well as the Kingdom of Poland, sat in one body. In terms of procedure, the national Sejm, if you will, the national diet, like the local dietines, was conducted on the principle of unanimity, a medieval practice that was never replaced by the more modern principle of majority vote. And as we're going to see in later periods, this antiquated principle of unanimity sometimes degenerated into the infamous practice of the liberum veto, that is, a negative vote of one member could, and sometimes did, bring all business to a standstill. But as long as the system of aristocratic parliamentarism worked, and it did, especially in the 16th and first half of the 17th centuries, Poland had a political structure characterized by a balance of power between the crown, the magnates, and the gentry. Now, the political and legal structure of Poland also contributed to guaranteeing the economic well-being, in particular the economic well-being of whom? Well, the most important social stratum in the country, the nobility, the magnates, and large numbers of the gentry. Their wealth was dependent on the landholdings that they had, and the degree to which they could exploit those holdings, and in particular, the labor of the peasants who lived on the land. During the 16th century, during the 1500s, we have a second wave of serfdom, where serfdom is coming to an end, proprietary serfdom, in the western part of the European continent. It is being revivified, if you will, in the eastern half of the continent, and hence it comes to be known as neo-serfdom. So whereas in the West, many of the privileges of the nobility are going away, in the East, many of them are being enhanced. And as a result of this, the peasant became attached to the land, subordinate to the will of the landlord, and that happened in Poland as a result of a steady flow of legal decrees, first in 1493 and then ending in the 1570s. So again, this very same period of Jagiellonian rule, we have the implementation of neo-serfdom. this neo-serfdom, proprietary serfdom, most rapidly put into practice wherever the population was dense and where, as a result of their numbers, peasants had smaller and smaller holdings and thus were susceptible to becoming indebted to the local landlord. And it's in this context that serfdom first became widespread in the western Polish inhabited Palatinates of the kingdom, Great Poland, Mazovia, Little Poland. And then only after, by the 16th century or the end of it, it was extended farther and farther eastward, and especially into the lands of Old Southern Rus in present-day Ukraine. This process of encirclement in Ukrainian lands generally occurred in the following manner. The large magnates, landowning magnates, both from Rus families and Polish Roman Catholic families, were granted large tracts of land where they created something called manorial estates. So we don't want to mix up social estates and manorial estates, where the manor house was. And that consisted of these manorial estates, hundreds, sometimes thousands of villages spread throughout sparsely settled eastern regions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that is present-day Belarus and Ukraine. And the magnates and the higher gentry there encouraged the migration of peasants, some of whom were only too glad to escape the increasing burdensome restrictions placed on them by the serf system where they lived in larger numbers, so they were encouraged to go east, young person, instead of west, young person, as the old phrase used to be in the United States. And to encourage these new in-migrants, many of whom had to flee illegally from their status under their own landlord, didn't make a difference. They would steal some peasants or offer them tax-free incentives, at least for an initial period of time, sometimes lasting 15 to 30 years. Come and work on our lands in the east, and you don't have to pay taxes for 15, 30 years or whatever. However, very important, the landlords owned outright or controlled the local mills for processing grain, and also, according to law, they retained the privilege of distilling and selling alcohol. So the serious matters were in their hands. Actually, both the Polish and Polonized Rus magnates and gentry were more often than not unwilling to run the huge manorial landed estates, called in Latin latifundia, over which they had control. You know, it took work to do this, and a noble doesn't need to dirty his hands or even deal with any of the problems of running an estate, no small operation, by the way. And so instead, they relied on middlemen, most of whom were Jews, the fifth in our list of social estates. A few words now about this social estate. Well, Jews had a long tradition, actually, of settlement in Ukrainian territory, a tradition that could be traced way back to the pre-Kievan times, the old Bosporan kingdom along the shores of the Azov and Straits of Kerch, and then later in the Khazar Empire, Khazar Khaganate. But the Jews of Polish-ruled 16th century Ukrainian lands were not, with the exception of a few immigrants from the south, they, for the most part, were descendants not from the east or south, but rather were mainly descendants of migrants who originally came from the Germanic lands of Central and Eastern Europe. Well, why would they want to leave? Well, pogroms and other forms of persecution that were connected with the Crusades and a popular hatred of Jews in medieval Germanic lands forced them, beginning already in the 11th century, late 11th century, to seek refuge. Where? By going east to Poland and Lithuania. Why, one would ask, however, would Jews want to seek refuge in Poland and Lithuania? Well, after the destruction caused by the Mongol invasions during the mid-13th century, which also affected Lithuanian lands, future Lithuanian lands in Poland, Polish rulers welcomed immigrants. They could be Jews, they could be other Germans from the west, or even Armenians from the east. Welcomed then to settle primarily in urban areas and to help Poland revive its cities after the Mongol invasions. And so before the end of the 13th century, before the end of the 1200s, the Jews were awarded the first of many privileges, the famous Statute of Kalisz in 1264, privileges that defended them as a group whose main business was money lending. And these privileges were given by the king. So they were royal privileges. The first influx of Jews into Poland, as I said, came from Germanic lands, specifically Silesia, Moravia in present-day Czech Republic. And these Jews were all of what is known as the Ashkenazi tradition, Ashkenazi. Or the Ashkenazim. That is, they spoke a medieval German dialect. They didn't speak Hebrew, by the way. They spoke a medieval German dialect called Yiddish. Yiddish. And that's distinguished being an Ashkenazic Jew as opposed to a Mediterranean or Sephardic Jew. In Lithuania, Jewish communities really began to expand only during the 14th and 15th centuries, after those regions had become part of Poland and Lithuania. Actually, initially, the situation of Jews in Lithuania was even better than in Poland, because that Grand Duke Vytautas awarded them a wide body of privileges, including tax-free concessions for their places of worship and burial, and the right to trade, hold any craft, and own land. So going to Poland and Lithuania, this was great for medieval Jews from Germanic lands. The further spread of Jews into Ukrainian lands was directly related to the Polish expansion and colonizing efforts after the 1569 Union of Lublin, when those Ukrainian lands actually became part of the Polish kingdom within the Commonwealth. And so as a result, between 1600 and 1647, the number of Jews in Ukraine more than tripled. So if at the beginning of the 17th century there were 45,000, by the middle of the century there were about 150,000. Now, this migration of Jews from the western provinces of Poland to Ukraine was primarily connected with their role in something called the arenda economic system. Arenda. What is arenda? Well, it refers to the lease of fixed assets or prerogative privileges, such as land, mills, inns, breweries, distilleries, or special rights such as collection of custom duties and taxes. Well, who had all these rights? The nobles. And so, in effect, Jews came to dominate this arenda system established by those Polish nobles, landlords in Ukraine during the 16th and 17th century. And for its part, Poland's landowning nobility was indeed anxious to exploit the rich agricultural resources of the area that resulted in profitable grain trade to the Baltic ports. But as I said, the nobles themselves had little interest in administering their lands, their vast landed estates, these latifundia, and also because of their own luxurious tastes and cultural standards, they did not have the necessary capital or commercial skills to exploit their properties. And so on both counts, they turned to Jewish capital and to Jewish expertise in leasing, this arenda system, so that before long, Jews managed to control a considerable portion of the agricultural economy in Ukrainian lands. Not surprisingly, these Jews who served as middlemen for the Polish landlords became, before very long, the symbols of oppression and exploitation, at least in the eyes of the peasant masses. And so, to assure this continuance of their dominant role in the Polish economic structure, our nobility, our landowning magnates and gentry also encouraged changes in the legal system. The first stage in this came in 1495 when the Polish Diet approved placing an increasing number of legal restrictions on the peasants' ability to lease. And this was that process of neo-serfdom. In a sense, it begins in 1495 with these decrees and ends in the 1560s, 1570s, again, coinciding with the Jagiellonian period. By the 1560s and 1570s, peasants were forbidden now, under any conditions, movement from their manorial estates. And faced with this situation, the discontented elements within the lower social strata had two choices. They could rise up, rebel, or they could flee further southward and eastward beyond the direct control of Polish and Lithuanian social systems. For the most part, they chose flight. And the results of this movement to the east led to the development of a new frontier society inhabited by people who came to be known as the Cossacks. And we will discuss the Cossacks at some length, central to our history of Ukraine, but for that you will have to wait at least one more lecture when we first have to finish discussing our social structure within Poland. Thank you.